the highly contested swing states. Of course, we are here in Wisconsin. This is a state that is the top of mind for a lot of voters. The election is expected to be very tight here. It was just a couple of thousand votes that could swing one of these swing states in either direction. Some key demographics could make all of the difference in that final tally. And right now, we want to zero in on young black voters and what the Trump administration is doing to grow their support in this community. Joining me for more on this is Bruce Levell. He's a senior surrogate for the Trump campaign and former national executive director of the National Diversity Coalition. Thank you so much for being here with us. We so appreciate your time. And let's jump right in. Look, we've seen what appears to be an increase in this election cycle in support for Mr. Trump. It is growing in these minority communities, specifically among young male voters. What would you attribute to any of these gains that Republicans are making in that demographic?
Well, thanks for having me. Well, I have to say this. I was privileged, as you introduced me in my title, Diversity Coalition Executive Director. That was the largest coalition in a Republican candidate's history back in 2016 by Donald John Trump. And so obviously the answer to that question is where this growth, or this, as I call it, this wave is coming from, is just the success of just in the previous administration. And something real important too, what people fail to realize, I've known President Trump since 1991. I met him in Atlanta. I've known him for many years, and we all have known him as being, the Don. He's been on David Letterman. He's been on Oprah Winfrey's show. He's been in a Bobby Brown video. He's been in Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. And, for 40 years, he's been out in the public eye. And so, obviously, the narrative they tried to push on him, he was a racist and all that. And I think, respectfully, it scared a lot of the black voters back in 2016. But lo and behold, now we have a contrast right now. Here in 2024, we look at gas prices. We look at, just basic food, inflation. A lot of these things that a lot of people, all Americans especially black culture, is looking around and saying, wait a minute. But most of all, the mass immigration that's coming over across our borders, where other cities have, as we call them, sanctuary cities, been giving more privilege to folks who hadn't paid into the system, and stepping over our black residents, our black voters, our black culture. So there's a lot of variables into the why this is growing, as you said earlier, black men in general, but black voters in general. So there's a lot to attribute to that, but mainly just the contrast of the success in the 4 years of the Trump administration to where we are now.
And that's really interesting when you bring up the concern of the leader of this country not taking care of the home front. That is a concern that I hear from voters really across this country, that they almost feel like this country is being overlooked in this moment. And I want to talk a little bit more about some of these policies that are really important, especially to some of these black voters. I know that the economy is top of mind, but as you mentioned as well, immigration and border security. And when you narrow it down, and do you really feel like Democrats at all are making the plea to these voters that are concerned about their bottom line, that are looking at their bank accounts every day, and they know that it is different now than it was 4 years ago?
Yeah, I like to say it like this. I wish the real Democrats would come back, because I think I have a lot of friends and family in the party, in the Democrat Party, for many, many years. I'm sure a lot of families, a lot of the viewers have the same thing. But, I think like what's really resonated more than anything is not so much as the party title, but the common sense. The common sense party, and President Trump's alluded to that early on during his campaign. It's like, listen, does it make sense for lower taxes? Is that common sense? Is it fair in the sporting venue as it relates to women's sports and protecting, et cetera? Is that common sense? Is that fair? Is it common sense to allow millions of folks come across the border that has not paid into the Social Security system, has not paid into our Health and Human Services, our federal payroll tax system? Is it fair for our congressmen and women who are in Democrat power turning their backs on the American people as well as black culture, and giving preferential treatment to folks who hadn't bought into the system and to the tax base, et cetera? So a lot of people are seeing this, and more than anything, what people fail to realize, during President Trump's tenure, we had the lowest black unemployment in my lifetime that was recorded since 1972. And there's a lot of things that he funded 10 years into the HBCU programs, the opportunity zones, which I'm perplexed why President Biden hasn't even said a word about that. And that was $1 billion initiative to go in underserved communities where I know being in Atlanta, a successful business owner in Atlanta, my wife and I for 29 years, I know of other colleagues that had benefited off of the opportunity zones that were able to build their businesses, and I haven't heard a word about that. So there's a lot of accomplishments and initiatives that President Trump put out there as a businessman, that were very successful. So, it gets back to the common sense. It's like, okay, are we better off now than we were back then? And that's for all Americans. I speak to everyone in your audience here, and that's a fair question. It's just like, no, it's not. So I think that you're going to see a record-breaking, Nixon and Lincoln, had the highest black voter turnout next to President Trump. But I think that record's soon to be shattered even more in the 2024 November 5th election. I think it's going to be catastrophic.
Oh, really? I would really love for you to elaborate on that a little bit. I mean, you think that we might have a historic vote here from black Americans for this Republican ticket based on policy? Yeah,
I think so. And I said earlier in the segment where, let's take the black wealth gap, for example. You talk about a businessman that understands, I call it the balance sheet. I understand profit and loss statements, business. And he understands, we know that, and that's why I talked about the opportunity zones. But just the fact that, pushing low taxes, pushing more initiatives to build back black wealth, which resonates well to black people in general. I mean, come on, look what we've been through historically. And more than anything, and this is a very important something I want to share with you and your viewers about President Trump. Remember, coming down the escalators and all the time to now, he ran on a platform of not being beholden to pay to play and special interests. Now, we all know what that does to our nation on both sides of the aisle. And that's been a breath of fresh air to have a candidate that won't pander, that won't be involved in a lobbying group that's going to tell him where he needs to vote, tell him who he needs to select, tell him what bill he needs to do, because he did not put himself in office based on promises. And that's what's wrong with this nation now on both sides of the aisle. That's why when you hear the word America First, that's what that really is. And that's why you're starting to see a lot of great America First folks that have in the tenure, the J.D. Vances, the Byron Donalds, the Burgess Owens, the John James in Michigan, and many others. They are part of the America First. Anna Paulina down in Florida. Many others that have come into this tent of America First in the last 4 or 5 years. And yes, black culture's like, hey, I want some of that. So it makes sense because it gets back to this, common sense. And that's essentially what we're selling the American people, and that's essentially what we're sharing with black culture and all cultures. Like, hey, come on and be involved with this. Let's put America first. Let's cut the tax. Let's make things where there's an environment to build back black wealth that's been a void for generations. And like I said earlier, the lowest black unemployment since '72 in my lifetime. Who can say that?
Well, yeah, Bruce Levell highlighting the opportunities he believed were created by the Trump administration for black Americans to build their own wealth and not do it with a government handout. Bruce Levell, this has been incredibly enlightening. Thank you so much for coming on our program. I hope that we can talk with you again soon.
Yeah, anytime. Thank you. Thanks for having me. God bless.